Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Cropper, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And I want to welcome you all here today on behalf of the trustees of the gallery to this biennial Wyeth Lecture in American Art. We're all deeply grateful to the Wyeth Foundation for American Art for making this possible and for their many other interventions in the field, especially the support of the Wyeth Fellowship at CASVA and this program of lectures and conferences. It's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Jennifer Roberts, Elizabeth Carey Agassiz Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University, who's been a member of the Department of Art History at Harvard since 2002, and who now also chairs the program of American Studies there. The Wyeth Lecture is intended to bring new thinking about American art to the Washington scholarly public and beyond. And when we ask our fellows at the center who is doing really interesting work in American art, the invariable response, especially from members of the emerging generation, is Jennifer Roberts. Professor Roberts, who won a Rosalind Abramson Award for Excellence in Teaching undergraduates at Harvard in 2005, studied at Stanford, majoring in art history and English, before going to Yale for her PhD in the history of art. She's written on a wide spectrum of topics, moving from lucubrations on a lava lamp, technocracy, counterculture, and containment in the 60s, an article she published in 2000, to work on the more familiar American icon John Singleton Copley, notably in essays on Boy with a Squirrel and the Dilemma of Transit, and Failure to Deliver, Watson and the Shark and the Boston Tea Party. The subtitles of these articles point the way to her fascinating exploration of the movement of images through space and time, and the implications of this for their reception, meaning, and understanding. This has also involved the study of historical intersections and cross-cultural encounters, as expressed in the volume entitled American Encounters, Art, History, and Cultural Identity, that she co-authored with Angela Miller, Janet Berlow, and Brian J. Wolfe, a previous Wyeth lecturer, in 2007. This phenomenon underlies the argument of her forthcoming book, Transporting Visions, The Movement of Images in Early America, which takes on the hitherto largely unrecognized problem of the complications of transmission in a historical and physical context. It also informs the subject of her first book, Mirror Travels, Robert Smithson and History, which was published by Yale in 2004. Smithson's own incidents of mirror travel in the Yucatan, around which Roberts weaves her subtle arguments, engages, in addition to notions of movement, the theme of mirror imaging. From Smithson, Jennifer Roberts made the imaginative leap to Jasper Johns, producing an exhibition and catalog on the crosshatch works and the logic of print at Harvard in 2012. And that brings her to the topic she will address tonight, in which the reversing and mirroring ineluctably required in printing is put under scrutiny in relation to American art. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Roberts.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I also want to thank Peter Lukehart and Elizabeth Kilpinski for their legendary CASVA hospitality in bringing me here. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's a very great honor to be here. And we're ready to go. If we could have the lights down. We could have the lights down. Oh, they don't? Okay, so I stay. I see. All right. Okay. Behind every print lies a matrix, from the Latin for mother, a plate or block or stone or screen from which the print has been pulled. And in most printing processes, the final print is a reversal of the matrix a reversal of the print. Almost every act of printing, whether of text or image, prior to the digital age, whether in ancient China or early modern Europe or 19th century America, was also an act of reversal. Everything that we evoke when we evoke print culture or the print revolution, the reproduction of images, the dissemination of beliefs, the communication of knowledge, the very properties of modernity depends upon the reversal and re-reversal of information. A ghost archive of reversals stands behind the vast majority of images and texts produced in modern history. I say that it is a ghost archive because those reversals do not usually reveal themselves out in the world where printed matter circulates. Once the print has been pulled from the press, the matrix stays behind. The print goes out into the world and the matrix is absented from the object that it has generated. It vanishes from the scene of print. The matrix has also tended to vanish from the scene of art history. Art history, when it attends to prints at all, tends to hasten after them as they speed away from the moment of pressing, focusing on the downstream consumption and dissemination of reproductive images. The primary narratives of the discipline do not linger on the act of production, the act of reversal, what we might call the fundamental backwardness that printmaking installs at the core of modern culture. And so when we look at prints and books and newspapers and broadsides and so on, it seems to me that we only see one side of them. The more I've thought about this, the stranger it has seemed. It's as if we were physicists studying matter but not antimatter, or zoologists studying only the right sides of animal bodies. Still, getting to that printerly antimatter, that hidden mirror of modernity, is not a simple task. It requires the development of scholarly skills that can tap into the conceptual and artisanal skills that go into the act of reversal in the first place. The kind of knowledge required to make a print matrix, to be a reverser, is largely what Pamela Smith and other historians of skill have called tacit knowledge, a knowledge held in the body, a way of working that is not always fully reducible to a formula or a set of instructions, a way of thinking backwards, upside down, inside out, that becomes automatic for the printmaker only after long training and apprenticeship. Printmakers attest to the mindset that matrix making requires. The engraver has to see everything reversed. That's W.J. Linton in 1884. You have to flip everything in your head. That's my colleague Matt Saunders just this year. And as Jasper Johns pointed out in 1979, printmaking simply makes your mind work in a different way. Now let me make it clear at the outset that I come here to talk about reversal not as an authority, but rather as a convert. I am not trained as a printmaker. I'm not even trained as a print historian. I managed to collect a PhD in American and modern art history from Yale in 2000 without knowing or really even caring about the difference between a lithograph and a woodcut or an etching and a screen print. My conversion experience came just 2 years ago when I found myself curating an exhibition on Jasper Johns for the Harvard Art Museums. It was Johns that pulled me through the looking glass into the reversed world of print. Johns, of course, is known primarily as a painter, without question one of the most significant artists of the 20th century. But he's also perhaps the greatest living printmaker. One of the things that struck me about Johns when I was working on him was his refusal to leave the matrix behind in his work. In symmetrical compositions like this one, Corpse and Mirror, Johns works as if to bring the matrix and the print back together. Indeed, throughout his work, which is full of flipped, hinged, and mirrored forms, what we might call the negative intelligence of the printmaker breaks through to the final image and breaks out of printmaking into other media. Indeed, Johns has spoken frequently about the impact that printmaking has had on his work in other media. Many of his works incorporate the memory of the matrix through the suggestion of some kind of hinged form that imprints and reverses within the image. Others, like field painting, right here at the National Gallery, incorporate these hinges literally. Field painting gives us the text, red, yellow, blue, forward and backward, as well as the imprinting object that demonstrates the hinged dynamics of the printing and pulling action in the studio. The fundamental proposition of my lecture this evening is that the project of reversal at the core of print culture has had a profound effect on a wide spectrum of American art. The negative intelligence, this shadow intelligence of print, its many forms of reversal and inversion can be found operating everywhere in the field, not only in the work of Jasper Johns. The issues at hand in these questions of print and reversal reach, of course, far beyond the American art subfield. But American art is a particularly productive place to think about them. The chronology of American art coincides neatly with the era of print, and because American art was generally pursued without a robust system of academic training institutions, a high proportion of American artists got their initial training as apprentices in the print trade. Apprenticed as an engraver, trained as a lithographer, found initial success as a commercial artist. Such are the typical preludes of American artist biographies. And here, just to give you two examples, John Singleton Copley got his start working on mezzotints with his stepfather Peter Pelham, and Whistler famously worked engraving charts for the US Coast Survey in the 1850s. Whether working in mezzotint, copper engraving, lithography, currency engraving, or wood engraving, many American artists first learned to think about images in reverse. Add to this the artists who were not initially trained in print, but later became serious printmakers, and the artists who worked closely with printmakers to reproduce and disseminate their work, and you've accounted for just about everyone in the pantheon of American artists. How might we move print then from the margins to the center of American art history? How do we take printing out of its customary role in the prefaces of artist biographies and give it a greater role to play in the larger narratives about American art? Now you might ask, at this point, why not just get right in there and organize the discussion around printmaking itself, around this meeting of printmaking? Why focus on the concept of reversal? Now for me, this is actually a strategic move that responds to what I see as the isolation of print discourse within art history, and hopes to move toward reorganizing certain habitual categories of thinking about print. There's an extensive literature, of course, on the history of printmaking in America, but that scholarship is largely isolated from the rest of the field's activities. And this is true in many other subfields as well, with the exception, perhaps, of early modern Europe, where print is really given a central role. The best demonstration of this for me is the simple fact that scholars who work on painting are called art historians, but scholars who work on prints are called print historians. One of my goals is to work toward an image of the field in which print historians are also simply art historians, understood to be engaged with all of the most fundamental questions that art history raises in and beyond the humanities. Thinking in terms of reversal opens up new ways of desegregating printing by making connections between different media and between the fine, decorative, and industrial arts. To speak of reversal as opposed to printmaking is to focus on an operation or a maneuver rather than a medium, an operation that pertains to many different media in different ways and thus cuts a cross-section through the arts that reveals different patterns than does an art history that slices up the arts by medium. So as we've seen, reversal is endemic to printmaking, but forms of reversal also govern casting in both sculpture and industrial production. Forms of reversal, of course, govern photography, and forms of reversal penetrate the decorative arts in many different ways, particularly in, as in this example, the generation of ornament and pattern. Another important advantage of using a maneuver like reversal to organize an art historical investigation is that even as it cross-fertilizes different media, it also bridges the material and the conceptual aspects of art making. To speak about reversal in printmaking requires, first, the most careful and microscopic attention to the niceties of materials and techniques, incision, carving, etching, pressing, etc. But at the same time, the term reversal opens out to the big issues that matter in the humanities and, for that matter, the sciences. Reversal is a scale-jumping idea that can leap quickly from the microscopic to the microscopic to the cosmic and back again. And just a few examples will have to suffice here. The ability to perceive things in reverse, especially to be able to balance both sides of a reversal in a symmetrical mental composition, has long been associated with some kind of higher perspectives, with the synthesis of opposites and the fusion of particulars with generalities. My favorite illustration of this principle from early American art are the nature prints of Joseph Breintnall. In the 1730s and 40s, Breintnall made a series of exquisite nature prints like this one as aids to the study and classification of plants growing in America. He made these prints by coating the leaves with printer's ink, arranging them on the right side of a large sheet of paper, folding the other half of the paper over on top of them, and then running the entire assembly through an engraving press. This produced a remarkably clear and uncannily symmetrical composition. The doubling in these images has the effect of perfecting the leaves, of transforming the arbitrary and accidental particularities of each leaf, its minor asymmetries, into what appears to be a purposeful, symmetrical, and balanced pattern. The mirror doubling, we might say, instantly contains the randomness and contingency of the leaves' initial arrangement on the paper, transforming them into something that's more like a design or a general system. These prints also perform another kind of reversal. The two sides of the composition are mirror images of each other, in contour anyway, but they do not simply show a reversed image of the same surface of each leaf, as you would have if this were simply a counterproof. Rather, what we see here are the simultaneous impressions of the upper and lower surface of each leaf, so that the left side of the print shows the top surfaces of the leaves, and the crisper, more precisely structured images on the right show the undersides, where the venation of a leaf is most pronounced. So it's as if we're seeing through the leaves, in essence, granted an impossible perspective in everyday experience, seeing both sides of a surface at once. So despite having been made in the most direct material manner possible and in the smallest possible space, having literally been squashed in a printing press, these leaves seem to have been raised above their worldly, humble status into another dimension. And indeed, Breintnall himself linked these mirrored leaves to a higher design and a form even of omniscience, indicating on one of his prints, and this is on the bottom right-hand corner of this print, that these leaves were, quote, engraven by the greatest and best engraver in the universe, end quote. And by this, he presumably meant God, not himself, but these open leaves do leave open the possibility of engraving as a kind of godlike activity. The implication is that these are symmetries perceptible only to God and also perhaps the occasional printmaker. Because reversal can provide such alternative perspectives, it also has long been associated with critique, assessment, judgment, justice. Think reversal of fortune, or as we say in the Red Sox Nation, reverse the curse. Think of the concept of proof. In printmaking, the term proof is used to designate a trial or preliminary impression taken to be checked for errors and marked for correction before the final printing. It designates the production of a reversal as an act of testing and correction. And thus it is that reversal lurks behind the broader concept of proof as the establishment or demonstration of truth or validity or authenticity. To reverse something is either to validate it or to expose its weaknesses, to prove or disprove it. This principle is at the heart of the long tradition of advice to painters, beginning, I believe, with Alberti, that they should examine their developing work in the mirror in order to perceive errors or other compositional infelicities with a critical eye. There are two excellent ways of discovering any weakness in a picture you have in hand. One is to look at it through a magnifying glass, which enlarges and makes its shortcomings more noticeable. The other, to reverse it in a mirror. The latter is an old and very popular method, for the eye becomes so accustomed looking at a thing in one way that it ceases to be critical. The moment the picture is reversed, it becomes a fresh picture, and in 9 cases out of 10, errors hitherto unnoticed reveal themselves. Related, finally, to this critical power of reversal are shades of the sinister. And I use the term sinister literally, inasmuch as the term derives from the traditional denomination of left and right as dexter and sinister, or I should say sinister and dexter. The left as the opposition and critique of the right, as that which works against the right. There is something sinister about the printmaker laboring away at the reversed image on the matrix. or if not outright sinister, at least something mischievous. Bruce Chambers, a printmaker, recently wrote a short essay called The Imp of the Reverse. Playing on Poe, of course, Chambers christens the printmaker as a kind of imp, an imp referring to a demon, an evil spirit, or at least the offspring of one, a mischievous child. The term brings into relief the power of the printmaker as it derives from a strange combination of seeming insignificance paired with critical powers. Beware the printmaker who seems innocuous, hunching over his tiny plate, but who sees through you, sees your shadow and your substance, front and back, left and right. So far I've reviewed some general rationale for why we might want to explore the concept of reversal as a way of generating new perspectives on print in art history and in American art history in particular. What might this look like in practice? For the remaining 2/3 of this lecture, I'll proceed with an experimental attempt at this by examining a particular intersection between print and painting in America in the period between about 1875 and 1895. And I'll focus on the problem of reversal as it emerges in a particular form of painting, trompe-l'oeil or fool the eye painting, and a particular form of printing that flourished at exactly the same time in America, namely wood engraving. And I'll be speaking in general ways as well about the connection between trompe-l'oeil painting and printmaking more generally. But printmaking in America in the late 19th century, in the way I want to be talking about it, was really focused on wood engraving. So that'll be the primary mode of printmaking that I'll be discussing. The issue of printing, much less of reversal, does not immediately leap to mind when looking at American trompe-l'oeil painting of the late 19th century. As befits its status as one of many episodic revivals of the longue durée trompe-l'oeil tradition stretching back to antiquity, trompe-l'oeil seems to be quite stubbornly and solely about painting, exploring the limits of painting's mimetic powers, flirting with painting's dangerous tendency towards deception, and engaging with painting's ontological boundaries. The characteristic maneuver, of course, of trompe-l'oeil painting is to produce an illusion so convincing that viewers do not even recognize that they're looking at a painting, but are then surprised, delighted, and perhaps even disappointed to find that they have been fooled. Trading in a play between belief and skepticism, trompe-l'oeil has had many moments of historical reemergence over the past several hundred years, in which it has embodied anxieties about deception, illusion, and unstable representation in different places at different historical moments. Scholars contributing to the large and now quite sophisticated literature on American trompe-l'oeil of this period have shown that trompe-l'oeil tapped into period anxieties about a Barnum-esque culture of deception in America, an urbanizing culture of confidence men and other shady characters, an economy debating the abandonment of the gold standard and openly positing that monetary value was an illusion, and in general, a rapidly modernizing culture looking back longingly at its retreating agrarian past. And my 3 examples on the screen are by the big 3 of American trompe-l'oeil painting of the late 19th century, William Michael Harnett, John Haberly, and John Peto, and I'll be focusing primarily on Harnett and Haberly this evening. What's less frequently noted about trompe-l'oeil and its modern context is that its rise paralleled that of the explosion of illustrated media in the later 19th century. Trompe-l'oeil, like all painting of this period, took its place in a new economy of printed images, an economy defined by the mass reproduction and dissemination of pictures, together with text, in the incredibly lucrative and popular illustrated newspapers, weeklies, and illustrated books. And when we speak of the rise of the mass image during these years, we're essentially speaking about the rise of a single printing technology, wood engraving. Wood engraving was the primary medium driving the explosion of illustrated books, newspapers, and periodicals during this time. As an 1884 article in the Art Amateur put it, quote, "Wood engraving was the process by means of which, by far, the greatest amount of knowledge, verbal or pictorial, is communicated to the world," end quote. Wood engraving abetted the rise of mass illustration and indeed became synonymous with it because it was cheaper than other intaglio print processes and also cheaper than lithography, and because the durability of the block withstood thousands of impressions, and especially because it could be combined with type in a single chase. Wood engraving could be combined with type because unlike copper engraving, etching, or lithography, but like letterpress, wood engraving is a relief printing method in which the image to be printed stands up from the block. Wood engraving matrices were made of finely polished boxwood, sliced to the height of letterpress type, which is about 1 inch. Boxwood was preferred because it was very hard and dense, and thus it could accept extremely fine engraving. The type and the orientation of the wood was different than the earlier tradition in the Renaissance and early modern period of wood cut. So when we're talking about wood engraving, it's different from the old tradition of wood cut. Not only was the wood harder and denser in wood engraving, but the blocks were sawn across rather than with the grain. And this meant that the engraver cut into the end grain of the wood, which reduced the interference of grain patterns and made the block much stronger and more durable. In order to carve this very hard block of wood, the wood engraver worked with sharp burins adapted from copper plate engraving. He rested the block against a small sandbag to cushion it and make it easier to rotate. Because the work was very fine-grained, magnifying glasses were often used, and the sort of hunched posture of the wood engraver was often commented upon in manuals and commentaries. Because wood engraving is a relief process, while working, the wood engraver had to produce 2 different kinds of reversal at once. First, the left-right reversal, common to all other period forms of printmaking. But second, he or she had to reverse the image, we might say, in depth. Rather than cut the lines to be printed directly into the wood engraver had to work, in essence, in the negative space, cutting away the wood surrounding the lines to be printed and leaving them standing. And I'll have much more to say about the reversals inherent in this relief procedure in a moment. Thus it was that wood engraving made reproduced images easily transmittable, combinable, and reproducible. It was wood engraving that gave images a place on the page with text. Wood engraving permitted the elaborate grammars of page layout that were so common in 19th century illustrated periodicals, including the close juxtapositions between text and image. Now, wood engraving would seem to be so technically alien to painting that there could be no meaningful relationship between the 2 practices. But in fact, the links were quite strong in the late 19th century. Because text and image could be literally interspersed, liberally interspersed, wood engraving permitted a new kind of discourse about painting, bringing not just paintings, but writing about paintings into a much broader and more vigorous circulatory field. As Amy von Lintel has shown in a recent article, wood engraving was largely responsible for the development and popularization of the field of art history in the later 19th century, because it allowed for the reproduction and recombination of the world's art objects in the context of a textual narrative. Wood engraving also developed correlations with painting in terms of the cross-training of artists. The huge market for illustrated publishing created a thriving industry for wood engraving on both sides of the Atlantic. Wood engraving became a lucrative career option for artists. As Anne Prentice Wagner has shown, legions of young men and women who dreamed of lives as fine artists recognized the economic uncertainties of such a life and instead sought training in wood engraving. And also, engravers of any ambition studied painting in order to improve their engraving work, usually enrolling in fine art courses whenever they could. The faithful reproduction of paintings was central to the culture of wood engraving in late 19th century America, and actually especially in America. American wood engravers were known around the world for their innovations in the reproduction of oil paintings, particularly for their ability to replicate in a fundamentally linear medium the tones, tints, and textures of oil painting. As wood engraving came of age in the 1870s and 80s, wood engravers actually began developing internal factions based on technique and approach, and the great schism in wood engraving during these years was that between the so-called new school and the so-called old school. Old school wood engravers had emphasized the medium specificity of wood engraving and insisted on the pure line as the true identity of the medium. New school engravers like Timothy Cole here on the screen gathered around the American illustrated periodicals and developed subtle new techniques for the imitation of textures, using things like white line hatching and stippling in order to attempt to capture not just the texture of objects that are imaged in oil paintings, but often the very gestures and brushstrokes of oil paintings themselves. And this is just a close-up of another Timothy Cole wood engraving, just to give you a sense of the detail and the way these engravings are actually made. The debate surrounding this issue during these years became a stage for rehearsing modern arguments over medium specificity. Old school engravers abjured tinting and toning in what they called the slavish imitation of other media, but the new school relished the possibilities of wood engraving as an interpretive practice. Wood engraving could transform itself into any other medium. Much of the discussion centered around the imitation of painterly texture, as I've suggested. The wood engravers strived for the imitation of painting then in two ways, both the illusionistic translation of oil paintings as subject matter, but also they aimed to imitate the very protean quality of painting itself in its own ability to adopt any mode of appearance. And as Timothy Cole, whose reproductions I've been showing on the screen, put it, in a word, he said, wood engraving has become no longer engraving per se, but painting. Given these general connections between wood engraving and painting, then, let's think about some of the specific connections between wood engraving and trompe-l'oeil. First, trompe-l'oeil paintings are preoccupied with reproduction and imitation, so much so that they frequently take on titles like reproduction and imitation. Then there's the patently obvious fact that a large percentage of the subject matter being reproduced and imitated in these paintings is paper, and within that, a large proportion is printed matter, cards, tickets, books, bills, etc. The American trompe-l'oeil painters spent thousands of hours replicating the appearance of printed artifacts, copying engraved and printed lines, replicating the textures of ripped paper edges, the embossed feel of engraved lines, etc. This in itself entails a significant act, both of connection to print and of reversal. Whereas those in the wood engraving trade were busy imitating the texture of paintings, here painters are busy imitating the texture of print. The second area of alignment has to do with the construction of the picture plane, and particularly the way the picture plane is understood to function in depth. One of the fundamental spatial rules of all trompe-l'oeil painting is that the artist should avoid deep illusionary spaces, perspective or foreshortening, because these effects rely on an optimally positioned viewer, so the perspective would fall apart if the viewer moved around the painting. Instead, the quintessential space of trompe-l'oeil painting is one in which the objects oscillate in a very shallow range in and out of the picture plane. The spatial illusions in this painting are limited to narrow niches and shelves, tacked and pasted papers, slim objects dangling close to opaque boards. It's worth noting, I think, that the structure of this illusionary space is strongly evocative of relief. The illusionary topography of these paintings, in other words, is analogous to the literal topography of the engraved woodblock or the printing plate. As painters that had been printmakers would surely have noticed, rack paintings like these on the screen treat the picture plane in ways very similar to a printing matrix, in which all spatial effects must be derived from a series of hollowings out or protrusions in low relief. And a good way to think about the way these paintings relate to the printing matrix, I think, is to think about if these paintings were actually real. So if the Peto painting was actually a cabinet door with this carving on it and these objects on it, it could be run through a relief printing press, and that would yield an image that would produce a print that would have a composition very similar to the painting itself, but of course it would be reversed. Then, of course, we also need to acknowledge that in virtually all of these paintings, the illusionary spaces of relief are created on wood. These paintings present us with a shallow space backed by wooden planks or boards, usually in the form of cabinet doors or other self-delimiting wood surfaces. Not only is the wood represented as the support, but it is full of carving, signatures, dates, miscellaneous graffiti of the sort you might find on a bar table, scratches, nicks, nail holes, and other textural elements. And in this sense, it's important to remember that during this period, any image alluding to carving or drawing on wood would have automatically evoked wood engraving. Indeed, the very notion of drawing on wood was a wood engraving term used to denote the work of artists who drew compositions in reverse on the woodblock for wood engravers to follow. there are two sections following where I'll be going into specific themes in these paintings. The first, the hinge and double-sidedness. William Michael Harnett was the most famous and celebrated of the late 19th century trompe-l'oeil painters. He grew up in poverty and was apprenticed in engraving as a teenager. He worked in copper, steel, and wood engraving before eventually specializing in silver engraving. So basically lots of engraving ornament on flatware. He continued silver engraving for much of the early part of his painting career. When interpreting his paintings, scholars have rightly focused on the incredible beauty and fidelity of his rendering of aged music instruments and the play between vision and touch that is set in motion by the way he texturizes key areas of the surface in order to create what we might call finger holds in his paintings. And this painting is hanging in the West Building, so you can go check this out for yourself. But Harnett has carefully textured the areas of the painting that depict turned up corners, crimped sections of paper so that one is tempted to reach out and touch them. What has not received so much commentary is another kind of standard iconography in Harnett's paintings, the exuberant, oversized, overdetermined hinges that he so lovingly details in his work. These have a simple realist explanation, of course. They signal that we are looking at cabinet doors, true enough. But they do much more. First of all, they're so large that they serve to frame the composition in an extremely conspicuous way. And, at least in these cases, they echo the color of the primary subject matter, so that they're the same color as the violin, the same color as the gun, basically taking up the same surface area of the painting as these instruments. In essence, the hinges declare themselves as instruments or even weapons in themselves. As we've already seen with Jasper Johns, who, by the way, knew and drew frequently on American 19th century trompe-l'oeil painting, the hinge is a figure, really more like a principle of the operations of print. As any printmaker knows and experiences daily, the pulling of a print or a proof from the matrix creates a drama of reversal in which symmetrical images pull away from a hinge-like junction. A hinge always implies some kind of rotation through real space or switching between reversed surfaces. Both of these kinds of operations were characteristic of Harnett's work in silver engraving, where he was employed generating ornamental patterns by reversing motifs, and where he was constantly having to translate flat design motifs onto curved or involuted surfaces that occupied three-dimensional space. In terms of the connections to his work in wood or copper engraving, Harnett's hinges invite and even demand that we imagine the reversal of these compositions, that we imagine them turned over on their hinges. The hinge bears with it the imagination of the painting in reverse, as if printed or proofed. We might say that it's a premonition of the painting's own reproduction, certainly a sign of its existence in a world of hyperbolic reproducibility. There's another kind of reversal implied by these hinges as well. Harnett's hinges are part of a larger iconography of impassable thresholds in trompe-l'oeil painting. The trompe-l'oeil paintings in late 19th century America are full of stuck or nailed shut drawers, cabinets with broken locks and missing keys, doors with rusted, inoperative hardware. This iconography participates in the play of illusion and disillusion that's part of the conceptual pleasure of trompe-l'oeil, as it conveys the status of painting as an art that invokes desire for virtual illusionistic penetration into the picture plane, but remains ultimately just a flat surface, an opaque, impassable surface. The painting in trompe-l'oeil is not an Albertine window, it is a stuck cabinet door. Harnett's hinges will never actually swing. Notice here, in fact, that the hinge is broken in the lower part of the painting. But there's another way to think about these broken hinges, another kind of spatial experience to which they refuse access. If we imagine that it actually were possible to open Harnett's door, we would see not only to the volume of space beyond it, but also to the other side, the reverse side of the door itself. Translated to the language of easel painting, Harnett's broken hinge conveys not just the opacity of the picture plane, but also its one-sidedness, its intractable one-sidedness. One of the things, in other words, on the other side of the picture plane that we're denied in this painting is the other side of the picture plane itself. There is a sub-iconography of trompe-l'oeil reaching back to at least 17th century Dutch painting that plays exactly on this problem, the back of the canvas picture. Although paintings like this purport to show us the back of the painting, what they ultimately confirm is painting's relentless frontality and one-sidedness. If you were, in fact, to turn this painting around, you would not find a picture, only another back. This painting, in other words, is an impossible object with two backs and no front. All space has been squeezed out of it. Overturning the picture leads, in essence, to a paradoxical object. In a brilliant exposition about Dutch trompe-l'oeil painting, Amy Powell has shown how these reversed paintings function as commentaries on the anxieties of the limitations of the easel painting format. And American painters also produced these kinds of reversed canvas paintings, and this is just an example by John Peto, Mr. Abraham Wiltsey's rack picture of 1879. Harnet's hinges ultimately demonstrate, we might say, the painful unidirectionality of painting, its one-sidedness. Painting is an example of what anthropologist Alfred Gell calls backless representation. The backlessness of painting is significant for our purposes because it starkly differentiates painted images from printed images, especially printed images in the era of wood engraving. Printed images occupied a much richer and more dynamic dimensional role than did painting in the late 19th century. Given the ascendance of wood engraving and its native integration of image and text, the printed image of the late 19th century could flow into a world of books and sheets and slips, a world of paper to be turned and paged and crimped and flipped, a world where images could be handled. Printed images definitively entered this double-sided world. To borrow a term from botany used to describe the double-sided structure of leaves, printed images in this period became thoroughly dorsoventral. They occupied a reversible, turnover world where there was always something over leaf. Harnet's paintings allude to this quite directly. As Michael Leja has shown, Harnet concentrates his most textural passages of painting, the passages that lure the viewer most imploringly to touch them, at the crimped corners of printed materials. This inherently acknowledges the reversibility and manipulability of printed matter. So why would you grasp at these corners if there wasn't something on the other side? As well as painting's ultimate inability to participate in it. So these paintings recognize the capacity of printed images, though every bit as flat as those of painting, and in fact often created by painting's logic. Printed images can weave themselves back into the real world, the world of space and fronts and backs, in a way that painting cannot hope to do. In other words, these paintings not only contemplate their ultimate inability to deliver up the world of illusion, they also contemplate their incapacity to penetrate the world of reality. And this reminds us that print, for all it has been equated in the scholarship with meditations on ephemerality and immateriality, print has, at least in this sense, a much stronger grip on literal reality than does painting. Print lives in the real world of real space, while painting can only stand with its back to the wall and watch the twists and turns of print as it moves. The engagement with the reversibility of printed media occurs in other areas of trompe-l'oeil as well. Its stakes are perhaps highest in currency painting, which is another prominent subgenre of American trompe-l'oeil. Currency paintings, as has frequently been noted, link the project of deceptive copying in trompe-l'oeil to the process of counterfeiting and to concerns, even deeper concerns, about paper money as a flawed or deceptive form of representation of value. In the context of these kinds of concerns, the question of reversible media, of reversible two-sided prints, becomes even more interesting. The painted bills made by artists like Haberle and Harnet looked astonishingly real, so much so that Harnet was actually arrested by the Secret Service for counterfeiting, and Haberle was warned against continuing his currency painting. By the way, Harnet desisted, but Haberle did not, continuing to paint images like this after being warned by the Secret Service against counterfeiting. If the invitation to pull and peel at the printed corners of trompe-l'oeil painting evokes a certain logic of verification, this logic plays an even greater role in the currency paintings. For the double-sidedness of paper money was synonymous with its authenticity in this era. It was on the reverse side, and I'm tempted to call it the B side, which dates me, of course, of paper bills that most of the anti-counterfeiting energies of bills were expended. It was there that the portraits and vignettes on the front gave way to the intricate labyrinths of machine-lathed ornament and long texts of counterfeit warning on the back of the bill. Haberle actually taunts the Secret Service outright with this painting of the back of a greenback, carefully painting out the text of the counterfeit warning that is printed on the right side of the bill. And you can't read it, but on the right side of the bill, it basically says you'll be sentenced to 15 years of hard labor if you counterfeit bills. But this bill ultimately is like Gisbrecht's painting of a reversed canvas. It gives us the back of the bill as if to claim this space of reversal, but after all, this bill is still only one-sided. The act of flipping over a real dollar bill is inherently an act of verification, authentication. It's an act to invoke the printmaking term of proof. Paintings, following this logic, are ultimately unverifiable. Trompe-l'oeil painting is always about the ultimate failure of the medium to deliver on the illusions it holds out. Indeed, it stages that failure as a central aspect of its address to the viewer. What Harnet's hinges and Haberle's greenbacks suggest is that the reversals of print enter trompe-l'oeil as its agent of interrogation, as its agent of proof. The role of double-sidedness in financial verification, by the way, is still very much with us. And you might think about whenever you order something online and they want you to give them that three-number code on the back of your credit card. The reason that code is used for verification is because in order to give them that code, you have to have a physical credit card object that you can turn over in space. It can't be something that someone has just scanned or screened from one side. So this double-sidedness of verification is still very much with us. And also I would add here that if we think about the importance of dorsoventrality or reversibility in printed objects, that helps us to see that actually in this sense, it's painting and not print that most closely resembles digital media today, where images on screens are all so profoundly one-sided, and they too share the kind of dimensional poverty of painting in a way that print does not. Part 2, the white line and the inversion of labor. In wood engraving, one form of reversal tends to cascade into another. Along with the basic left-right reversal is the reversal of the figure-ground relationship that comes with relief cutting. A simple line is relatively straightforward to produce in, say, a copper engraving. The engraver simply engraves a line. The incision on the plate, which will be filled with ink and printed, translates directly to the mark on the final print. But to make a line in a wood engraving, the artist does not cut a line. The artist chips around a line-shaped area, leaving the line standing. The worked surface on the plate becomes the unmarked surface on the print. This basic inversion at the core of cutting in relief has huge implications, one of which is the disruption or inversion of the relationship between labor and result in printing. The marks on a wood engraved print are made without labor. They represent precisely the parts of the block that have been left alone. The more labor that is expended on a block, the less dense and substantial the marks on the print. The artist's efforts are actively reversed, expended only in order to disappear. The inversion of the relationship between labor and mark had a certain absurdity or even cruelty about it that was frequently noted. Indeed, as a method of industrial image making, it brought into harsh relief the broader destabilization of the link between labor and product in modernity, providing a kind of strange topography of pictorial alienation. The finished print, again, was made by the areas that the artist did not touch. At the level of the mark, not a single black line on any of the millions of wood-engraved images circulating in the later 19th century was actually made by a wood engraver. This destabilization of the connection between labor and product was much commented upon in period sources on wood engraving. John Ruskin made vivid numerical accountings of the labor economy of the practice. In one particularly memorable section of his Ariadne Florentina, he reproduced a schematic of a crosshatch pattern that had been wood engraved in the periodical Punch, and showed that whereas the artist drawing on the block was able to make the crosshatch pattern in a few strokes of his pencil, the wood engraver that had to leave these lines standing had to chip out all of the interstices between these lines. In this wanton and gratuitous cross-hatching, quote, there are about 30 of these columns with 35 interstices each, approximately 1,050, certainly not fewer, interstices to be deliberately cut clear to get that 2 square inches of shadow. Now calculate or think enough to feel the impossibility of calculating the number of woodcuts used daily for our popular prints and how many men are day and night cutting 1,050 holes to the square inch as the occupation of their manly life. And Mrs. Beecher Stowe and the North Americans fancy they have abolished slavery. I wish I could go into more detail about this text, which is very, very interesting in its discussions of slavery, and particularly in the relationship between black and white in wood engraving. But I don't have time. W.J. Linton, probably the most influential writer on wood engraving after Ruskin, simplified the motif but maintained its essential spirit in his manual. He reproduced the simplest possible crosshatch, really more of a tic-tac-toe pattern, and demonstrated that whereas the draftsman could produce this pattern in 4 strokes, it would take a woodcutter between 32 and 36 cuts in order to chip away the external edges and interstitial spaces in order to leave the pattern standing in relief. And indeed, that's exactly what it had taken to produce the illustration on this page, by the way, which is a wood engraving set into the text. So it is not only the labor of the not only is the labor of the wood engraver invisible in the final set of marks, but there's an exponentially greater investment of labor expended toward that invisibility in wood engraving than there is in any more direct mark-making practices. So labor is inverted not only in presence, but also in effort. And indeed, while blackline wood engraving was frequently assigned by cruel or oblivious art editors during this era, wood engravers quickly recognized that this kind of blackline cross-hatching was essentially imprisoning them. And over the years of wood engraving's ascendance, other more efficient methods of engraving were preferred. And the primary method was known as the white line method. And this followed the innovations of Thomas Buick at the beginning of the century. And this was basically a way of cutting the block that imagined the ground of the drawing as the black section that would be printed from the block and all of the marks that would be made on it as white marks, so that the closest analog in white line wood engraving would be writing with chalk on a blackboard rather than writing with pen on paper. As one article explained, this was the least labor-intensive way of making wood engravings. Nowhere in the whole engraving is there any labor expended for the purpose of making a black line. The engraver accepts the black, which he finds ready to his hand, and makes every white line do its duty. It is a picture produced in white lines on a black ground. So this, in other words, brought yet another kind of reversal into the engraving process. The engraver now has to think, as it were, in the dark, imagining his work as the bringing of light into a black void rather than bringing a dark form onto a white ground. Bear in mind that all your black is ready-made for you in the block, which, wherever it is left uncut, will print a solid and uniform black, and that your business is to produce light by removing portions of it. In this system, by definition, the most efficient image, the image involving the least expenditure of labor, dare I say the most ready-made image, would look something like this. Only something like the light writing of fireworks can be rendered with an autographic mark in wood engraving. The trails of light in an image like this are simultaneously the most laconic kind of mark and the most expressive kind of mark, the only kind of mark where the labor of the wood engraver breaks through to the signifying image. I think all this sheds new light on that other great monument of controversy over pictorial labor of the late 19th century, the storied origin of asceticism and the laconic image, Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold. This is, of course, the painting that led to the Ruskin-Whistler trial after Ruskin had accused Whistler of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face by daring to exhibit such a slapdash and seemingly laborless image. Whistler's nocturnes and their momentous reversal of the traditional economy of visible and confirmable labor seem to me not just to be inspirations ex nihilo by a contradictory genius, but rather inspired translations into painting of the already destabilized, already inverted world of labor in imagery production in wood engraving. The destabilization of artistic labor in wood engraving also helps us to perceive a shared language between aestheticism and trompe-l'oeil, two painterly modes of the late 19th century that could not otherwise seem more different. Consider John Haberle's slate paintings, like the one on the left, which, like Whistler's painting, borrow the dark light reversals of wood engraving, recognizing that the sort of tabula rasa of the pictorial field is actually something closer to a blank slate, meaning slate in the literal sense. Like Whistler's, Haberle's paintings tap into the destabilization of pictorial labor value by highlighting literally a form of mark that is associated with a minimal expenditure of gestural effort. Haberle was apprenticed to an engraver at age 14 and practiced several forms of printmaking, including copper engraving and lithography. On his business card, which I'm showing you here, he listed drawing on wood as one of his specialties, which again means that he was accustomed to translating images to wood blocks in preparation for wood engraving. So while drawing on wood, he had to think ahead to the wood engraver's work. He had to draw in reverse and anticipate the carving of the drawing in relief. He had to think about whether the drawing would imprison the wood engraver in wanton cross-hatching or would instead allow for a more commensurate translation of labor. Haberle was well aware of artistic developments across the Atlantic and very probably read not only the transcripts of the Ruskin trial, but also Ruskin's lectures on engraving. Regardless, his slate paintings seem to be knowing commentaries on Whistler's pictorial labor politics. Whistler's flung pot of paint becomes Haberle's rapid, casual, childlike scribbles, which include stick figures, a cartoon cat, and a palimpsest of atmospheric erasures that seem remarkably Whistlerian in their effect. And he also includes, and it's very hard to see here, but just up here, on the painting, there is, of all things, a tic-tac-toe game. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that this looks exactly like Linton's cross-hatching diagram from his wood engraving manual, but nevertheless, there it is, tic-tac-toe on the slate. Ruskin felt that the wood engraver should not be overworked, as we've seen, but he should not be underworked either. And here's how he describes the wrong kind of too lazy wood engraving. If you put just a few touches on wood, you draw as on a slate with white lines, leaving a quantity of black. Thin, light lines may be struck in an instant on the woodblock. Nevertheless, even thin, light ones must not be used except with extreme caution, for observe, they are equally useless as outline and for the expression of mass. You know how far from exemplary or delightful your boy's first quite voluntary exercises in white line drawing on your slate were. You could indeed draw a goblin satisfactorily in such a method. A round O with arms and legs to it, and a scratch under two dots in the middle would answer the purpose. So Ruskin's image of an irresponsible wood engraving is essentially a child's drawing on slate. Haberle's slates then insert themselves directly into the debate surrounding pictorial labor value in this period and reveal the centrality of wood engraving to the instigation of those debates. He relishes the inversions of labor at issue, allying himself with Whistler's many improprieties rather than Ruskin's orders, we might say. And I think leave your order here is actually a punning reference to all of the various orders that Ruskin was giving artists at the time. More broadly, the disappearance of labor has always been part of the discourse of trompe-l'oeil painting. The fundamental operation of trompe-l'oeil, convincing the viewer, even if only for a moment, that they're looking at a slice of life rather than a painting, inherently performs the disappearance of the artist and the artist's labor. Yet in order to produce this disappearance, immense amount of labor must, of course, be performed. Finally, I think the strange passivity of trompe-l'oeil connects to these inversions of labor. As David Lubin has shown, it is significant that the objects in trompe-l'oeil paintings of the American late 19th century are invariably old things, not things of their time. Dented and rusted, tattered, splintered, weathered. They are the very antithesis of quintessentially 1890s commodities like, as Lubin points out, tennis rackets or bicycle wheels. This is part of the melancholy of these paintings, the sense they give of a world passing away even as it springs up before us in such vivid reality. What the reversals of wood engraving help us to see is the status of these objects not just as old, but as what we might call leftovers. They're objects that simply remain, objects left where they hang, just as the printing surface in a wood engraving made meaning out of what was left where it stood. Whatever else these objects might mean, these paintings share with wood engraving, and Whistler's aestheticism for that matter, the idea that the picture is made more or less by letting the thing alone. The picture emerges from sufferance, forbearance, simply letting things stand. I want to end this evening with a painting that I wish I had more time to discuss, John Pedo's Reminiscences of 1865, painted in around 1890. This is a memorial to Lincoln, his passing and the passing of the Civil War era. Pedo inscribes Lincoln's birth and death dates as illusory engravings. Birth in relief, death in intaglio. Lincoln's entry and exit from the worldly plane is figured as a reversal. And this leads me to some final thoughts on the obsolescence of wood engraving in the 1890s and perhaps the obsolescence of print today. By the mid-1890s, wood engraving was essentially over. Like Lincoln, it was cut down at the height of its powers. What killed wood engraving, not immediately, but within a span of 10 years in the 1890s, was the development of the halftone, which translated photographs into a dot pattern that could be acid etched onto a plate that could then be used directly in the letterpress. The images produced by this technology were markedly inferior to wood engraving from an aesthetic perspective, and many people, artists and public alike, commented on the dull, foggy, and lifeless quality of these new halftone illustrations. But they were also markedly cheaper. In 1893, a magazine could buy a halftone for less than $20, while the cost of a full-page wood engraving was $300. In 1894, Harper's fired half of its engraving staff. In 1890, the Cooper Union discontinued its wood engraving classes. In 1870, 100% of the images illustrated in Harper's were wood engravings. In 1895, it was only 1%. The halftone screen might be seen as a harbinger of today's image reproduction technologies, which are based on screening, scanning, and sampling, rather than carving, pressing, and reversing. We are faced now with the end of print, or at least its radical repositioning. In order to understand what print was, we would do well to attend to its reversals and to the broader cultural impacts that those reversals have that will, we hope, survive them. Thank you.
I think our speaker has agreed to take a few questions. If you could raise your hand.
Any questions? Yes.
I'm curious about, you make a very convincing case, I'm really quite convinced of the relationship between wood engraving and what you're seeing in these paintings, and in a couple other realms of pictorial production. But I wonder to what degree a painting like this might be haunted by the specter of photography already, without the mediation of halftone. And I ask in part because the Linton crosshatch that you showed us is, I find it fascinating because it tries very hard to duplicate the look of the pen rather than any trace of the engraver's passing across the wood, which seems to be an effort at making it photographically mimetic.
Right. That's an excellent question and really a good point about the little tic-tac-toe because I hadn't quite made that connection myself. Yes, photography plays into this story in a very interesting and complex way. And there's, from the perspective of wood engravers, photography is a specter that is haunting the practice from, for decades prior to the 1890s. For many years, photography and wood engraving were essentially working in symbiosis because for many years, you actually could transfer photographs onto wood blocks. So in many cases, particularly in the large illustrated weeklies, the so-called drawing on wood was actually done with a photograph. So the block surface would be sensitized, a photograph would be projected onto that, and then you would have a reversed photograph on the wood. This was a nice way, for example, to reduce the scale of images. It was a good way of getting actual photographs onto the block. It was also a good way of translating, any other kind of drawing or painting would often first be photographed and then put on the block. But throughout that, and that helped, that was one of the reasons that illustrated publishing in images became so important, particularly in newspapers, because you had at least somewhere back in the production process the idea of a photograph coming into the realm of print. But prior to the halftone, you couldn't actually get that photograph onto the newspaper. You couldn't get it in print, in mass reproduction, without a wood engraver there to translate the photograph into a wood engraving. So, so there are all kinds of really interesting problems that are raised up. There's a lot of discussion about how photography works in the wood engraving community, particularly in the later 1870s and 1880s. And wood engravers begin to see the halftone on the horizon a few years before it happens. And it's very sad reading reminiscences by wood engravers in the late 1890s and early 20th century. They felt that their profession had just reached the point where it was becoming a real art, where there was this incredible profusion of different styles, and then it was just cut off by the halftone. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was particularly interested in your sort of remarks around labor and also your allusion to race.
Uh-huh.
Very captivating. But what I would like you to talk about, if you can, is gender. And this is, I think, particularly important as of the constitution of the medium itself. You spoke of matrix,
Mm-hmm.
psyche of the masculine and the feminine
Mm-hmm.
part of the process. And it's often forgotten in terms of the printing process itself, the sort of the labor of women in media like trompe-l'oeil,
Yes.
is very important. But just below the status of the artist, it seems to me. Whereas, on the other hand, the trompe-l'oeil paintings very often depict very masculine subjects, like hunting and
Mm-hmm.
various objects associated with professions and so forth. So
Right.
gender, I think, is a very important dimension
Mm-hmm.
ingrained in your argument about reversibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's an excellent point and an excellent question. And I think you've actually helped me think about another way in which trompe-l'oeil and wood engraving go together during this period, because you're absolutely right. Trompe-l'oeil is this, in many ways, an image of a kind of a nostalgic masculine world about smoking pipes and hunting and whatnot. And wood engraving was also an incredibly masculine kind of printmaking, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, around the large illustrated weeklies, particularly the weeklies and the monthlies. And there was this entire sort of homosocial culture around wood engraving in New York, at least, which is where I've done most of my reading during this period. It was the kind of work culture where women were not invited, because it was a kind of, it was a deadline culture where men would be working together all night on, getting the wood engravings done for the next morning's print run. It was often fueled by visits to saloons. And in fact, that was a kind of standard practice when you had to get a bunch of engravers together to work all night on a deadline. The first thing you would do would be to go out and have a few drinks. And there are discussions of this where the men would go out and gather at the bar and then wander up Broadway, stopping in on all the saloons and looking at the paintings hanging there, which is another whole very interesting story. Many of the paintings hanging in the saloons on Broadway were trompe-l'oeil paintings. So yes, and I think wood engraving, there are women wood engravers, particularly in the more fine art, oil painting, reproduction side of things, but the publishing industry, the Harpers and the Scribners, was much more hostile to women during this period. So it was different from like Currier and Ives, where you have rooms full of women doing the coloring or sitting around tables doing coloring. It just there wasn't quite the same place. So it's a great way to think about how wood engraving, and there's also just something kind of manly about chipping away at the wood. You hear the discussions of the way it's actually practiced are kind of willfully, they often the wood engravers will position themselves almost as kind of hicks or farmers, chipping away and furrowing away at the wood. They use this very masculine kind of vocabulary even for the action of producing the mark, or not producing the marks, I should say.
Yes, Josh.
So I love to talk, and I found it convincing on a lot of points. One thing I'm just still trying to sort of think through a little bit what the implications are for our characterization of printmaking and painting of art and sort of technology and so on over the period. And one of those areas of implication that I'm curious about is about the relationship with your many points about reversibility to more frequently uttered remarks about printmaking, about its indexicality and its material relationship to the physical world and so on. And one of the key moments that I kept thinking about, or details that I kept thinking about where I think this relationship is interestingly at work in the trompe-l'oeil painting, is in this crazy thing about there being so many doors, right? So it's not walls and so on. It's doors. But specifically, as you said, frequently cabinet doors. But there's a kind of scale problem that implies, because there's always the possibility that you're looking at the door to a room rather than the door to a cabinet, it seems to me. So very often, so the violin is almost legible as a cello, but make you know that it isn't.
Right.
And so on. And that's true, I think, of this painting. It's a little hard to get a grasp of what the measurement
Right.
is in question.
Right.
And so it seems to me there's some kind of play going on, not only with back and forth, but also with its non-material, non-sculptural quality. That is to say, its scale problem.
Trompe-l'oeil scale problem.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting, because actually another rule of trompe-l'oeil is that everything has to be actual size. Like, you can't have a trompe-l'oeil painting that's out of scale, or else it won't be convincing. So, and this is another media issue. Of course, I'm showing you these paintings at this scale, which is clearly not their actual scale. And this is an optical digital technology through which we learn everything we know about art history these days. So I think that the problem with scale and the difficulty of determining whether it's a violin or a cello, and just whether these are cabinets or actual door thresholds, is actually not a problem that comes up when you actually look at the trompe-l'oeil painting itself. And so you're objecting, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that's also an important tie with print, which is, of course, I mean, when the matrix, the rubber hits the road, to invoke Cage and Rauschenberg, prints are always actual size. There's no scale shifting going on in the actual act of printing. So the attitude towards scale seems to me to be fundamentally similar.
Maybe one last
Okay, we'll discuss later. Okay.
We've got a mention here.
Yeah.
David, yes.
Hello.
Jennifer, that was fabulous and really beautiful, elegant lecture, but I wonder to what extent your lectures are trompe-l'oeil.
Oh.
Well, in the sense that I think every great art history lecture is almost by definition a trompe-l'oeil, because you're juxtaposing images and pieces of text and creating an illusion of the historical reality that we feel we've entered into. Of course, it's only, we're not entering into the historical reality, but you're trying to get us there. So I think the sort of thing I was wondering is, in terms of within the logical lecture, it's just beautiful and seamless. But you're saying that printmaking, particularly wood engraving, was a marginalized art form that wasn't considered as respectable as fine art painting. And then you show some fine art painters like Cornette and Peter
Mhm.
of American art also dealing with this, or is it sort of the minor speaking to the alien?
That's great. I mean, I think the trompe-l'oeil painting shares some of the, at least the class marginality that wood engraving did. I mean, trompe-l'oeil painting is not aestheticism. It doesn't have the right kind of highfalutin subject matter and seemingly conceptual ambitions that were expected from fine art painting. So I think I'm making a connection, I guess I would say, with the impishness of the wood engraver and the very impish humor of these painters, which is often being, I think, these painters I think are often using wood engraving as a conceptual resource for opposing mainstream high aesthetics. That said, Whistler, I think, would be probably the first place I would want to go to talk about the way that the kind of logics that appear in wood engraving can show up in painting that seems to have nothing to do with it. And of course, Whistler obviously is also an incredible printmaker, making prints throughout his whole life as he's painting. Whistler does all kinds of printmaking, including wood engraving, so he's very familiar with what it means to do a relief print. He's very familiar with what it means to do white on black when he paints his nocturnes. But he's, I think, processing wood engraving, I guess, in a slightly different way than someone like Haberle would, because Whistler's the one who goes on to create the etching revival later in the century, which is in many ways a reaction against the mass-reproduced image. I haven't thought through, all the other bigs of American art yet. I mean, that's part of what I see as my job in carrying this project through in the future. But it seems to me that anyone producing images in the 1880s in America has to contend with this kind of production and all of the inversions and all of the problems that it raises and all the questions it raises about what it means to make an image and what it means to make an image that will be distributed and reproduced. So, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And we'd like to invite members of the audience to join us for a small reception upstairs, if you can, in the reception room. Thank you.